I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
There's not much I can say about General Douglas MacArthur that hasn't already been said better by others. However, there are quite a few aspects of his character that I want to expand on, given that he was the single man who most influenced Charles Willoughby during his adult life. Sir Charles deeply admired MacArthur, as did all the army men of his generation. I would argue that General Mac was the US's last truly legendary military leader. And I don't mean that in any moral sense, I mean that more about his stature amongst the US population and his fellow army cadre. But with such a reputation came a growing and increasingly destructive ego. Douglas MacArthur's hubris and near obsession with independence consistently put him at odds with the ruling brass at the War Department, and later with the Wall Street Yankee Blue Bloods who architected the post-war world order. To understand Douglas MacArthur, especially his consistently negative disposition against the Eastern elite, we need to start with his father, Lieutenant General Arthur MacArthur Jr. As a young Union Army lieutenant from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Arthur MacArthur first distinguished himself during the Civil War, most famously leading a successful charge during the Battle of Missionary Ridge in November of 1863. The 18-year-old West Point graduate inspired his compatriots by bearing the Union flag and raising it triumphantly at the top of Missionary Ridge. The next year, at the Battle of Franklin, the elder MacArthur was severely injured, taking a bullet to the chest and the leg. By the end of the war in 1865, MacArthur had been elevated to the rank of lieutenant colonel. Whether it was due to the political realities of the Reconstruction era, or due to genuine resentment from the U.S. Army cadre, Arthur MacArthur's wartime heroism would not be recognized for another 25 years, as he would eventually be awarded the Medal of Honor for his performance at Missionary Ridge, but not until 1890. Following the end of the Civil War, still recovering from injuries and facing a rapidly demobilizing U.S. Army, Arthur MacArthur briefly left military service to follow in his father's footsteps and enter law school. Arthur MacArthur Sr., Douglas's grandfather, was a Scottish-born lawyer turned judge who first made a name for himself in Massachusetts and later settled in Wisconsin. For 4 days in 1856, Arthur MacArthur Sr. served as the governor of Wisconsin, still the shortest tenure by any governor in the state's history. This was before serving as an associate justice in the Supreme Court of Washington, D.C., where he would spend his last years. The law profession was not a good fit for his son Arthur Jr., who only spent a couple of months at law school before begrudgingly returning to the military in 1866 as a first lieutenant. One of the major themes of Arthur MacArthur Jr.'s life was a pervasive feeling of being an outcast. Despite being a West Point graduate, usually a quasi-requirement to becoming a general in the Army in these times, Arthur was continuously passed over. After a quick promotion to captain 6 months after returning to the Army, MacArthur remained a captain for nearly 25 years until 1889. Admittedly, the late 1800s were a relatively uneventful period for the U.S. military. During this period, Arthur MacArthur participated in the so-called Indian Wars, the genocidal campaigns throughout the Great Plains, to accomplish the American Manifest Destiny. During this time in 1880, Arthur and his wife Mary Pinky Hardy MacArthur, nicknamed Pinky for short, had 3 sons: Arthur III, Malcolm, who died shortly as an infant, and of course, Douglas, the youngest. Growing up as an army brat, Douglas MacArthur followed his parents from base to base, never truly having time to settle in one home. Milwaukee was the family's anchor, but Doug only lived there for short stints as a teenager. The Indian Wars aside, this period between the end of the Civil War and the Spanish-American War saw Captain Arthur MacArthur set off on an assignment that would not only be formative for himself, but also fundamental to his youngest son, the then 3-year-old Douglas. In 1883, Arthur set off with his young family to China to serve as a military attaché in the country. This marked the beginning of the MacArthur's family's long history in the Far East. According to Michael Schaller's biography titled Douglas MacArthur, the Far Eastern General, which I'll be pulling from extensively, during his 1883 tour of China, Arthur MacArthur drafted a policy paper for former President Ulysses S. Grant, titled, quote, Chinese Memorandum and Notes. which emphasized the essential importance of the Far East to the newly whole continental United States. In his essay, Arthur describes the so-called quote-unquote China market as essential for American expansionism, especially as the domestic consumer base became increasingly saturated. His conclusion? The China market was, quote, the real stepping stone to supremacy throughout the commercial world, end quote, and that the US should seek new markets, quote, principally in the Far East, end quote, as these new Asian consumers would allow for a nearly infinite expansion of the continental production base. What Arthur MacArthur was describing was nothing new. His so-called China market was better known at the time as the China trade. Important to note that although it was colloquially known as the China trade, this term included all of East Asia, including trade with the Philippines and Japan, after their economy was opened up after centuries of isolation by U.S. Navy Admiral Matthew Perry in the mid-1850s. Coincidentally, the MacArthurs are distant relatives of Matthew Perry. I have discussed at length on this channel the prominence of the unequal trade relationship between northeastern United States commercial houses, especially in the booming opium trade, with East Asia. Firms such as the American-run Russell & Co. and the British giant Jardine Matheson, still in business today as Jardines. Yet Arthur MacArthur was envisioning a US-Asia relationship that went beyond simply acting as China's dope dealer. He viewed the Pacific Rim as the future customers of American consumer goods in a paternalistic relationship where the US would build a new Monroe Doctrine in Asia, both as an economic driver post-Manifest Destiny, but also to keep the Russians out of the Pacific. This line of thinking, firstly, the importance of Asia to US markets, and second, America as Asia's guarantor, would be equally embraced by his son Douglas throughout his life. A decade and a half later in 1899, after being promoted to Brigadier General finally, during the Spanish-American War, Arthur MacArthur was sent to Manila, Philippines to lead US forces during the Philippine-American War. With the Spanish freshly expelled from the archipelago, local Filipino resistance organizations sprung into action, sparking the first of many guerrilla wars of the 20th century. MacArthur's mission in the Philippines was not simply a military one. He was elevated to being the military governor of the islands, the third American to hold that post. He would remain in that role for a little over a year, while the machinations that took place during that relatively short period would have an outsized impact on both the elder general's outlook and, more importantly, that of his youngest son, Douglas, who at the time was a cadet at West Point Military Academy. General MacArthur's appointment to military governor of the Philippines came at the exact time that the McKinley government at the time was beginning the transition from military rule to civilian rule in the new US possession in the Pacific. With a seeming lull in the fighting in 1900, it appeared that the Philippines had already been consolidated under US control. MacArthur himself said as much in a May 1900 speech, when he declared that the rebels were crushed, and a few days later, he was declared military governor. His singular rule on the islands would be short-lived, though, because in June 1900, the White House sent over a group of bureaucrats to begin the transition in Manila to civilian rule, known as the Philippine Commission, headed by future President William Howard Taft. It was at this juncture that the MacArthur family resentment for the Wall Street plutocrats really set in, for both father and son. William Howard Taft, the first civilian governor of the Philippines, was one of a triumvirate of high-powered bureaucrats and politicians that in many ways ruled the US in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These three men's quasi-oligarchic control of the US's foreign apparatus for 20 or so years would effectively shape the US empire as we know it today, and lay the groundwork for the northeastern Wall Street-dominated neoliberal world order of the Cold War. These three men were the aforementioned William Howard Taft, Theodore Roosevelt, and Elihu Root. As arch-Yankees from prominent Wall Street circles, these three patricians represented the epitome of the post-Civil War Republican aristocracy, based largely out of New York. William Howard Taft, for example, was the son of lawyer and bureaucrat Alphonso Taft, who acted briefly as President Grant's Secretary of War and Attorney General from 1876 to 77, and an ambassador to Russia in the mid-1880s. To really illustrate the pedigree of this grouping, In 1832, Alphonso Taft was the co-founder of the Skull and Bones Society at Yale College, the perennial secret society that over the next century would birth the careers of dozens of the most prominent administrators, lawyers, and bankers of the U.S. ruling elite, not to mention large parts of the early cadre of the CIA. Alphonso Taft co-founded the order with William Huntington Russell, of the equally prominent Russell family. This is the same Russell family as Russell & Co., the largest American trading house on the infamous China trade, and in turn the most significant American opium distributor in China. We can see here the links to East Asia are baked into not only Skull and Bones, but also the Taft family by association. Both Alphonso's son William Howard and his grandson Robert would be members of Skull and Bones. The three patricians I mentioned earlier were close associates in New York high finance circles, but really hit their stride during the McKinley presidency. It was the McKinley administration that sparked the Spanish-American War, began fighting in the Philippine-American War, and started the surveys for the then Nicaraguan Canal, which would of course eventually become the Panama Canal. Guiding U.S. policy during this rapid colonial expansion was our second man, Elihu Root, who served as Secretary of War from 1899 at the end of the quick Spanish-American War until 1904, to hopefully neutralize Cuba and the Philippines. Beforehand, Root was a prominent New York corporate lawyer with a vast array of wealthy clients, such as President Chester A. Arthur, William C. Whitney, and railroad tycoon E. H. Harriman, father to banker and Skull and Bones alumnus Averell Harriman. Elihu Root can be largely associated with the political rise of the third major figure in this triumvirate, the one and only Theodore Roosevelt, whom he supported early in a mayoral race to be the mayor of New York in the 1880s. When Root was selected by McKinley to be Secretary of War, he was seen as a man with a vast network of connections, close ties to Wall Street, and a knack for international relations. Soon enough, he'd be serving a different president, his protege, Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt first became president in 1901, not by electoral victory, but due to McKinley's untimely death. Of course, old McKinley's assassination was timely to Roosevelt, Taft, and Root, who were waiting, ready to steer the American empire into the new century. Given the PR tour that Teddy had been put on as a prominent outdoorsman in the rugged Dakota wilderness, leading the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, leaving his post as Assistant Secretary of Navy at the time, he was in many ways groomed for the job beforehand, as he had become a national figure even before becoming vice president. After taking the place of the mostly forgotten Vice President Garrett Hobart at the Republican National Convention in June 1900, he'd only have to wait a little over a year to September 1901 before he'd become president for nearly 4 years without even being elected in a general election. Now, that's not to say that he wouldn't have won a general election. Teddy Roosevelt was a popular figure across the country for his largely overblown exploits. That said, the path to power is indifferent, as Teddy took the White House while Root and Taft looked on with excitement. Now, you may be asking, why did I spend so much time in all this? Well, Roosevelt became president just as General Arthur MacArthur had been recalled as military governor of the Philippines some 3 months earlier in July of 1901. From day one, military Governor MacArthur and civilian Governor Taft butted heads in their short-lived dual role in Manila. Adam Burns, in his 2010 PhD thesis titled An Imperial Vision, William Howard Taft and the Philippines 1901 to 1921, explores in detail the fraught relationship between the general and the bureaucrat. Citing historian Brian Lynn, Burns argues that the major difference between both men was their estimation of the strength of the Filipino resistance to U.S. rule. MacArthur applied controversial counterinsurgency policies in the Philippines, employing some early examples of psychological operations to varied effect. In this sense, the general was quite innovative, hosting several different events throughout the islands where local leaders could mingle with the new American civilian authorities. Most prominent was a major so-called fiesta, organized by MacArthur's staff to try and quell disaffection and to work as a positive PR event for the U.S. occupation authorities. This type of local outreach agenda was innovative at the time, when the norm at the time was to employ brutal, old-style extractionary colonial policies with no attempt at crafting a PR campaign or nonviolent counterinsurgency strategies. In many ways, Arthur MacArthur espoused the same ideas as future counterinsurgency guru Edward Lansdale would 4 decades later in the highly mythologized pacification campaign in the Philippines during the Hukbalahap Rebellion right after World War II. Interestingly, while in the Philippines, Arthur MacArthur did help elevate the career of a young Captain John J. Pershing, Blackjack himself, who would have such a profound influence on his son Douglas and all the future generals of World War II. Pershing was in the Philippines first as a lieutenant, working on counterinsurgency on the island of Mindanao. Impressed by his abilities, MacArthur personally met with him and even introduced then Colonel Pershing to his son Douglas in 1903. A decade and a half before they would serve together in World War I. So although MacArthur's time as military governor of the Philippines was short, he did leave a recognizable legacy. It also served to imbue him, and by proxy his son, with a colonial attitude, especially with regards to the ever-prized Philippines. Despite the animosity, Taft recognized the successes of MacArthur's outreach policies, especially the parties the general planned, with Taft claiming in July 1900, quote, "If there's one thing more than another that a Filipino likes, it is a fiesta," end quote. Yet Taft and his circle were not privy to the new counterinsurgency paradigms that were starting to develop in the army. Another point, which very well may have been correct, was that Taft believed that the U.S. Army government represented the ultimate evil to the Filipinos, especially as the army betrayed the very resistance organizations that they had once supported in their fight against Spain. The Philippines Commission was viewed as a softer option, without all the baggage of the U.S. Army. The bureaucrats were also getting frustrated with Arthur MacArthur's increasingly defiant attitude. Simply put, quote, his subordination to civilian authority, end quote. Incidentally, his son Douglas would be consistently accused of the same behavior by the very same circles that Taft was prominent in. For example, Assistant Secretary of War during World War II, John J. McCloy, often nicknamed the chairman of the establishment for his wide-ranging ties to Wall Street and the government apparatus, called General Douglas MacArthur, quote, a man on horseback threatening democracy, end quote, for his singular handling of post-war Japan. We can see, like father, like son, both MacArthurs resented the civilian masters in Washington, D.C. and on Wall Street, and sought their own paths forward in their respective assignments. This tension between being a good soldier and following civilian orders, or bucking the hierarchy and charting one's own course, represented the central, lifelong struggle for both MacArthur generals. Ultimately, though, Taft would successfully unseat Arthur MacArthur from the Philippines. With the help of then Secretary of War Elihu Root, a mentor to him, he was able to pull some strings to get General MacArthur recalled in July of 1901, to be replaced by General Adna Chaffee, who had just come back from putting down the Boxer Rebellion in China. This arrangement would only last one more year before Taft enjoyed full civilian control of the colony, with no military authority next to him. That September, Teddy Roosevelt would become president. 2.5 years later, in February of 1904, Taft was recalled from the Philippines just as the second phase of the Philippine-American War, known as the Moro Rebellion, was kicking off. The early years of U.S. occupation in the Philippines were especially brutal, with the wholesale killing of Filipino civilians and even the use of concentration camps. The fighting was savage on both sides, with between 15 and 20,000 Filipino combatants and 4,200 American combatants killed. This is not including the estimated 200,000 civilians that died due to starvation. Nonetheless, Taft was rewarded in 1904 with Elihu Root's old job as Secretary of War. Not long after, Root would be back, this time as Secretary of State, alongside Taft at the War Department. This cyclical appointment pattern was a distinctive feature of the highly elitist government bureaucracy of the turn of the century, as these three men exerted fantastic influence on the U.S.'s foreign policy during these early years of overseas empire building. Teddy Roosevelt, coming up on his last years as president, convinced Taft to run in 1908, and unsurprisingly he won. This may have been too much for General MacArthur to bear. Seeing his former rival elevated to the position of commander-in-chief, a man whom he did not respect and viewed as a lightweight, must have dealt a critical blow. Apparently so, as Arthur MacArthur retired from the Army in 1909 with the rank of Lieutenant General. 3 years later, Arthur MacArthur would be dead. As for Taft, he would serve one more term as president before being unseated by Democratic nominee and internationalist Woodrow Wilson. By this point, Teddy Roosevelt had turned on his old ally Taft, after he failed to win the Republican nomination in 1912. He ran for president anyways, under his newly formed Progressive Party, known colloquially as the Bull Moose Party, which pulled a significant portion of Republican votes away from the ambitious Taft. This is not a story that I have the time to get into in detail, but we can see that the Taft-Roosevelt-Root axiom had come to an end with the splintering off of Teddy. Afterwards, Taft would go on to teach law at Yale, before becoming a Chief Justice from 1921 to 1930 to close out his career. But maybe most consequently of the three, after leaving the government bureaucracy in 1909 and serving as a U.S. Senator from New York, Elihu Root would cement his legacy through the creation of arguably the most influential U.S. think tank of the 20th century, the Council on Foreign Relations, in 1918. I have spoken of the CFR in the past, and it will come up later in many instances, but in short, the CFR would become one of the major policy and lobbying organs of the Wall Street establishment, especially after it was adopted by Rockefeller interests in the 1930s. The CFR could be considered the beating heart of U.S. internationalism in the 1900s, and it was created by the perennial Elihu Root. Simply put, from 1899 to 1913, this triumvirate of northeastern scions laid their mark on the U.S. colonial project, and, in turn, pushed many against their cause, including General Arthur MacArthur and his son. While Arthur MacArthur feuded with William Howard Taft in the Philippines, his youngest son Douglas was completing his education at the West Point Military Academy as a cadet. Getting his son into West Point in the first place proved challenging, taking until 1899, the year Arthur landed in the Philippines, to get him admitted, again illustrating Arthur MacArthur's continued exclusion from the military establishment. Douglas MacArthur was 19 at the time of admission, considered old for West Point inductees. Douglas's time at West Point was marked by intense hazing and academic excellence. Due to his father's prominence as a Union Army hero during the Civil War, Doug was bullied immensely by primarily Southern cadets at the academy. The academy itself was a mess at the time, between the hazing and the outdated curriculum. According to Schaller in his biography of Douglas MacArthur, West Point at the turn of the century could be described as, quote, an anachronistic shrine most notable for outdated military instruction, brutal hazing, and an archaic curriculum, end quote. Still, under these circumstances, Douglas was one of the top of his class. He and his father corresponded regularly through letters. The elder MacArthur would tell his son of his times in the Philippines, the importance of the island to U.S. strategic interests in the Pacific Rim, especially vis-a-vis the rising Japanese. According to Schaller, quote, General Arthur MacArthur had stressed the importance of American control of the Philippines as an element in shaping the future of East and Southeast Asia. A strong colony, he argued, would block Japan, secure vital economic interests, and enhance America's stature as a world power. All these arguments resonated in his son's later actions, end quote. These words would stick with Douglas until the day he died. Not only did he truly believe in the American colonial project, but it could be argued that he saw the Philippines as a central part of the MacArthur family legacy itself. Securing the islands, especially during World War II, became a near obsession, almost like a sacred mission, to fulfill the ambitions that his father had been prevented from reaching. Prevented by those men in suits in Washington, D.C. and on Wall Street. It wouldn't be long before Douglas would be sent for the first time of many to the Philippines himself, in 1903 after graduating from West Point as an Army engineer, second lieutenant. He would later that year be posted to the islands during the first years of the Moro Rebellion in the Philippines. This early experience in the Philippines would be fruitful, as the young MacArthur befriended two future leaders of the country, Manuel Quezon and Sergio Osmeña, the future second and fourth presidents of an independent Philippines. At this time, when MacArthur was still an inexperienced junior officer, he would set the foundation for his dramatic return and escape from the Philippines some 35 or so years later at the outbreak of the Pacific War with Japan. Until the First World War, things were largely uneventful for Douglas. Captain MacArthur participated in the Veracruz expedition in 1914, a temporary occupation of the eastern Mexican state of Veracruz as a part of the larger Mexican Revolution. This was only a few years before the Pancho Villa expedition that Willoughby undertook under the command of General Pershing in 1916 and 17. But it was in France during World War I that newly promoted Major MacArthur distinguished himself as arguably the most promising young officer in the U.S. Army. In 1917, when the U.S. entered that war, Douglas approached the Army Militia Affairs Office proposing to form a new division of volunteers from U.S. states that had yet to be organized into proper divisions. This came to be known as the 42nd Infantry Rainbow Division. Rainbow because of the diverse makeup of the divisions from 27 different National Guard units across the states. He was then made Chief of Staff. In creating the 42nd, the young MacArthur, elevated to colonel for the occasion, had created a command for himself and was effectively organizing the division as he saw fit. A level of command that was unheard of for a 37-year-old Army officer. Throughout his career, but especially in World War I, MacArthur's young age made him an extremely well-liked figure among his fellow soldiers. He apparently told the men he served with to call him Buddy, and was able to maintain good rapport with his junior officers as they were nearly the same age. The Rainbow Division was also composed of the 51st Iowa Infantry, which had once been under his father's command in the Philippines during the Philippine-American War. Some of the older officers in that group knew Doug's father, which ingratiated them to his son's command in France. MacArthur's division was instrumental in the fighting at Lunéville-Baccarat, where he was elevated to Brigadier General, the youngest general in the American Expeditionary Forces. He fought in the Champagne-Marne offensive, where he accompanied his men through no man's land on several occasions, and throughout the war he was awarded 7 Silver Stars, the Purple Heart, the Distinguished Service Cross, and I'll remind you, alongside Wild Bill Donovan, and finally the French Croix de Guerre. It was also during the First World War that Douglas MacArthur's obsession with control began to seep in, which in turn fueled his ongoing paranoia. On many occasions throughout his time in France, MacArthur was in disagreement or in open opposition to his superiors at the American Expeditionary Forces headquarters in Chaumont, France. Most notably, MacArthur's relationship with John Blackjack Pershing and his aide, then Major George C. Marshall, soured throughout the conflict. This continuous animosity would build into a genuine rivalry between both men, especially when George Marshall was Army Chief of Staff during World War II, holding the ultimate control of MacArthur's divisions in the Pacific. As I alluded to earlier, this constant disdain for authority and higher-ups would grow to become open hostility for what he perceived as jealous or malicious bureaucrats and desk-bound officers that were constantly trying to obstruct his plans. I want to highlight a passage from the famous mainstream biography of Douglas MacArthur titled American Caesar. Now, with a title like that, as I'm sure you can assume, this book is undeniably an extremely flattering and at times outright reverent portrait of Douglas MacArthur. Very rarely does author William Manchester allow himself to criticize the general, except in regards to his consistent paranoia. From the book, discussing his time in France as a brigadier general in 1918. Quote, "There were, he came to believe, people in the army out to get him. Desk-bound men who envied and resented a fighting officer. This was the beginning of his paranoia, which was to bring so much anguish to him and to others in the years ahead." End quote. From hearing stories from his father of the military brass's disrespect of his achievements, to the Taft clique shuttling him away from the Philippines to be instead administered by bureaucrats, to now having to kowtow to the opinion of an aged General John Pershing instead of simply being able to follow his own tactics. All this crystallized into a fundamental paranoia that the office-bound other was trying to hold him back. This paranoia seeped its way through his entire cadre, especially as he came to increasingly surround himself with sycophants who shared his essential vision. General Charles Willoughby would come to share in MacArthur's paranoia and his deep-seated resentment of an amorphous East Coast elite, an old-school army establishment and a secret communist threat that loomed around each corner. World War I turned MacArthur into the military leader that Willoughby and the rest of the generals around Doug would come to revere. During the interwar years, MacArthur served in several capacities that only further embittered him to the U.S. Army brass and the military establishment more broadly. From 1919, immediately after World War I, until 1922, a 39-year-old Douglas MacArthur served as the superintendent of the bastion of American Army education, that being the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York. Interestingly, this allowed him to retain his brigadier general rank after the war concluded. As a young cadet, he had witnessed firsthand the persistent hazing problem and the ineffective curriculum while he studied there some 20 years earlier. MacArthur at the time was the youngest superintendent at West Point since the so-called father of West Point, Sylvanus Thayer, back in 1817, came into the role with a reformer's mindset, looking to modernize the academy. During his time as superintendent, he introduced the Cadet Honor Code, a set of values intended to curb hazing, and he made a concerted effort to introduce more political and economic courses to the curriculum to bolster Army officers' proficiency in so-called civil affairs, harkening back to his father Arthur's experimentation with PSYOPs during his year in the Philippines. At the time, graduating from West Point was seen as something of a rite of passage to reaching a generalship. West Point graduates formed a sort of insular club of their own, first meeting as cadets and usually following their class up to the top of the military hierarchy. If you did not have the good fortune of attending West Point, chances are you were likely never becoming a general. This was especially the case before the Second World War and the associated explosion in the number of generals in the U.S. Army. Still, Mac tried to reform the Army with little luck. According to Michael Schaller again, MacArthur's 2.5 years as superintendent were a frustrating disappointment, as the old brass consistently pushed back against his introduction of typically non-military concepts into the curriculum. In the coming years, despite being a West Point graduate himself and serving as a superintendent of the institution, MacArthur showed a hesitancy and general ambivalence in selecting West Point graduates to fill out his cadre. Maybe it was just chance, or maybe it was a bias that had built up over the years against the so-called West Point elite. But generally, MacArthur's staff in the Pacific was made up of men who did not come from the prestigious military academy. For the remaining interwar years, MacArthur shuffled between domestic army postings and assignments back to the Philippines. A persistent stain on MacArthur's career was his treatment of the 1932 Bonus Army protesters. In 1932, some 17,000 World War I veterans and over 40,000 protesters in total camped outside the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. to demand bonus pay for their service during the Great War. The issuance of bonus pay was typical at the time for volunteers and recruits to compensate soldiers for the loss of wages they experienced while serving in the Army. 1932 was the nadir of the Great Depression. Many of these protesters had been unemployed since the crash in 1929. Major General Douglas MacArthur, recently elevated to Army Chief of Staff in 1930, was deployed to quash the protesters in D.C. MacArthur believed that the bonus marchers were part of some communist conspiracy to dismantle the United States. During the Great Depression, there was a significant anxiety amongst the United States ruling class that a communist revolution was on the horizon. During these days, the Communist Party of the U.S. saw record membership numbers. Yet for the bonus marchers, Army intelligence reports noted that only 3 of the 26 or so leaders were members of the Communist Party. And of the rank and file, the percentage was thought to be even lower. Nonetheless, when the orders did come down to break up the encampment, Douglas MacArthur ordered then Major George Patton to lead infantry, cavalry, and 5 tanks towards the camp of frustrated veterans. What ensued was a cavalry charge armed with bayonets as tear gas was employed to disperse the protesters. To this day, the death toll is unclear. What is clear is that under MacArthur's command, U.S. Army forces charged, injured, and killed U.S. Army veterans for mostly peaceful protesting. Revealed here is MacArthur's anti-communist impulses that would manifest in his choices of generals around him in the Philippines. MacArthur was increasingly becoming a prominent figurehead among old right Republicans in the Midwest, and as we will see, his political ambitions would only grow from here. As the so-called Scourge of the Bonus Army Marchers, which he portrayed as communists, MacArthur stood as one of the most visible faces of American anti-communism during the Great Depression. This reputation would follow him into the Pacific. And finally, after that hopefully instructive detour, we get back to Willoughby, who in the mid-1930s was a full-time instructor at Fort Leavenworth's U.S. Army and Command General Staff School, where he had just graduated a few years earlier. The command school at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas trained many of the future generals of World War II, including Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and George Patton. Willoughby, for his part, stayed on as a teacher. He is almost unanimously cited as a brilliant instructor, primarily specializing in civil affairs, such as languages, history, and politics. Would it surprise you to know that Willoughby was also a lover of theater? According to David Foy in his biography of Willoughby, the Prussian teacher was remembered by students as, quote, one of the most gifted thespians to ever play a romantic lead in the drama club, end quote. Sir Charles was known to walk around sporting a monocle at times, really cultivating his image as a European noble in an American army uniform. And had it not been for General MacArthur, Major Willoughby may have remained at Fort Leavenworth Officers' School for the rest of his career. And honestly, he likely wouldn't have minded it. He appeared to thrive in an academic setting, and he specialized in disciplines such as translation that were increasingly in high demand, especially with the US presence in the Philippines and eventually Europe and East Asia more prominently during World War II. Yet as Willoughby recounted late into his retirement in 1971 during an interview at his house in Naples, Florida, he first met Douglas MacArthur in person in 1935, while the Major General was touring the educational facilities at Fort Leavenworth. As the story goes, and keep in mind, this is Willoughby speaking, so it could be embellished, MacArthur walked into Willoughby's classroom while he was lecturing about military history. Captivated, Mac sat through the entire lecture. Later, while the two were serving together in the Pacific, as Willoughby recounts it, MacArthur told him that during that lecture in 1935, he had already decided that Willoughby would become a member of his staff in the Far East. MacArthur in 1935 had just been granted a new posting as military advisor to the newly semi-independent Commonwealth of the Philippines, under the leadership of President Manuel Quezon, the man he met and befriended some 30 years earlier as a lieutenant in the Philippine-American War. Soon Quezon would grant him the title of Field Marshal of the Philippines in 1936, in order to organize and train the new Philippines Army. It wouldn't be until 1940 that Willoughby would be plucked from a short posting in New York, working on the Military Dictionary Project, to serve in Manila under MacArthur, first as the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, and eventually, just as World War II broke out, elevated to Intelligence Chief for the Far East, head of G2 Intelligence. Since 1930, a decade before Willoughby would join him, General MacArthur had been shuttling to and from the Philippines on various assignments as the Army's point man in the Commonwealth. In the early 30s, during the height of the Great Depression, when most Americans could barely put food on the table, there was a popular movement brewing to grant the Philippines independence. This was not based in altruism or any sense of moral duty. Instead, it was based on the simple fact that the US was still paying a sizable sum of money every month to maintain the colony, at a time when the US economy was a total mess. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, at the time an isolationist Republican, stated that Congress desired, quote, not to free the Philippines from the United States, but to free the United States from the Philippines, end quote. Vandenberg would become a leading internationalist after World War II, but his statement at the time in the 1930s were a legitimate feeling across the old right Republicans at the time. Chosen for the job to help shepherd the islands into independence was then Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur, a man who, as I covered extensively, had deep familial connections to the islands. He was comfortable amongst Philippine high society, and personally had a chip on his shoulder from his father's dismissal from the islands 30 years before. From 1928 to 1930, he had already headed the Philippine Department, a U.S. Army organization on the archipelago that operated as an Army Corps staffed primarily by Filipinos. These were primarily organized under the Philippine Scouts, which traced their origins back to the beginning of U.S. occupation in 1901. MacArthur's time in the Philippines before being made Field Marshal in 1936 was fairly inconsequential, except for one other glaring stain on his record. In 1930, coming off a divorce from his first wife, Louise Cromwell Brooks, Major General Douglas MacArthur, already one of the most celebrated U.S. Army generals of the time, started a relationship with a Filipina vaudeville actress named Isabel Rosario Cooper, the daughter of a Scottish father and a Filipina mother. Although there are questions regarding her year of birth, the consensus is that she was either 16, 18, or 21 at the time. Douglas MacArthur was 50. The two were romantically involved for the next couple of years, with Douglas even bringing Isabel back to Washington, D.C. with him when his tour in the Philippines came to an end. There should be no illusions about this fling. MacArthur himself saw the shame and very possible legal ramifications involved in this type of statutory relationship. He kept the relationship a secret from his 80-year-old mother, and when he brought the actress back to DC, he hid her away in his Georgetown apartment. She called him Daddy, and for a time he showered her with gifts including a poodle, kimonos, and black lace lingerie. William Manchester, in his biography American Caesar, claimed that MacArthur provided her, quote, few street clothes because he saw no reason why she should go outdoors. He wanted her always there for him. Like many another lover, he had put his paramour on a pedestal and expected her never to leave it. End quote. The relationship lasted until 1934, when MacArthur broke it off and paid her $15,000 to return to Manila. However, she stayed in the US, opening a hair salon for a time and eventually taking her own life in 1960 from a barbiturate overdose. Manchester, in his hagiography of MacArthur, tries to excuse this obviously inappropriate behavior by a major general by claiming that the early 1930s, while MacArthur was sitting behind a desk in Washington, were an especially mundane time to be an army officer. During this period, MacArthur was often seen strutting around in a kimono, cooling himself with an oriental fan, and smoked cigarettes from a bejeweled cigarette holder. This was Douglas MacArthur at his lowest, fooling around with a barely legal concubine while jumping aimlessly between non-combat assignments. Undeniably, MacArthur's posting by Roosevelt to the Philippines was a welcome change of pace in October 1935. He brought his mother, a lifelong confidant, along for the trip. By 1936, Philippines President Quezon made him Field Marshal, a role that elevated MacArthur to seemingly the same heights as his father had when he was military governor of that very same archipelago. The general saw his role as a nation builder, granted a unique opportunity to shape a new state's military hierarchy from the ground up. As he spent the latter half of the 30s on the islands, he began to assemble a clique of officers around him that would follow him throughout World War II and beyond. One such officer that would not make the list was then Major Dwight Eisenhower, who served under MacArthur as his primary aide in the Philippines from 1935 to 1939, before returning stateside and having an illustrious career of his own during World War II in Europe. This combination, MacArthur and Eisenhower, was like oil and water. The straight-laced, by-the-books Dwight was not impressed by the freewheeling, domineering, and often authoritarian MacArthur, who increasingly demanded a sycophantic attitude from his subordinates. According to Michael Schaller, Eisenhower claimed that MacArthur, quote, desired to guide the destiny of the Philippines, end quote. And by 1938, the general had fully alienated his staff, primarily composed of Majors Eisenhower and James Ord. Their time together in the Philippines fueled a lifelong rivalry between the future supreme commanders of World War II. This rivalry would hit a climax later during the 1952 Republican National Convention, when both Ike and MacArthur were candidates for the Republican presidential nomination. Of course, as we all know, Eisenhower would win that one out. But back in the late 30s, following Ord's premature death in 1938 and Ike's departure the next year, Willoughby and MacArthur's clique entered the picture. From 1939 onwards, General MacArthur surrounded himself with atypical generals, not of the West Point mold of the outgoing Eisenhower and deceased Ord. Take, for example, Willoughby, a language and history expert with a penchant for politics and covert ops, as we saw with his work in the RIF. For General Mac, who was looking to not only bolster the Philippines military, a goal that gained increased importance as Imperial Japan continued to sweep through China, but also to shape the country's post-independence state, an intelligence officer like Willoughby was an asset. Upon his arrival in the Philippines, Willoughby immediately made his presence known by becoming a mainstay at the Spanish Club in the city. The upscale society club, geared towards Spanish Filipinos, holdouts from the Spanish period on the islands, was a nucleus of important business contacts in the country. Interestingly, the Spanish club was filled with Falangist sympathizers, men who admired Spain's new dictator Francisco Franco, who had just solidified his rule of the country after the Spanish Civil War ended in 1939. These Spanish loyalists, according to a 1952 article on Willoughby, controlled an estimated 80% of the island's wealth. As we know, Willoughby was also a loyal fan of Franco, which made his entrance into these old Spanish colonial circles quite seamless. The names at this club would have been familiar to most Filipinos at the time, as the preeminent Spanish families that had dominated the island's civil society. The Sorianos, the Elizaldes, the Brias Rojases, and the Zobels, for example. Willoughby, for his part, became close personal friends with Andrés Soriano, according to the article, who was the most prominent member of the Spanish Club. Named president of the San Miguel Brewery, the oldest brewery in the Philippines, Soriano soon acquired contracts from Coca-Cola to bottle their drinks in the colony. Soon he established A. Soriano Corporation, known colloquially as ANSCOR, which operated as a holding company. ANSCOR came to own significant shares in almost all areas of industry on the islands, most notably mining, oil exploration, and airlines. Most attractive to Willoughby was Soriano's leadership of the Philippines Phalange, the Filipino branch of Franco's Phalangist party apparatus. He was a major booster of Franco during the Civil War, as the #1 donor to his cause from the Philippines during the conflict. During World War II, Soriano would be brought into Manuel Quezon's wartime administration as Secretary of Commerce, and eventually served as a colonel on MacArthur's staff in the Pacific Theater. Here we are starting to see the atypical officers that would be brought into MacArthur's circle. The emphasis was on nation building, a trait usually not explicitly sought out in military leaders. Before meeting Willoughby in 1940, Soriano had already befriended MacArthur and others on his staff during his time in the Philippines in the late 30s. Notably, Soriano was close to another future general on MacArthur's staff, a man that would become Willoughby's rival in the MacArthur circle, that being a Manila lawyer named Courtney Whitney. Having last served in 1927, Whitney had garnered a reputation as one of the most prominent American corporate lawyers in the Philippines. A George Washington University law graduate, Whitney came to personally represent MacArthur during his time in the Philippines, possibly aiding him with the fallout of the whole Isabel Rosario Cooper debacle. Whitney would be known as MacArthur's personal stooge, a fixer of sorts, and a key piece of his growing political staff. The Seagraves call him MacArthur's, quote, intimate crony in their book Gold Warriors. The stout, porcine Whitney would butt heads with Sir Charles as the two's mandates often overlapped, especially in the later occupation of Japan. Still, Whitney was a key asset to MacArthur, with deep ties to Filipino society. He was also a true loyalist to Doug, a near prerequisite to becoming a part of his staff at this time. From an oral interview from 1989 with Joseph Raw Jr., an Army officer on MacArthur's staff from 1942 to 45, we get an indication of this trend in MacArthur's close circle of confidence. Raw claims in the interview that the entire staff were sycophants. The interview asks regarding the MacArthur cadre, quote, and those were the only ones he'd have around him, rubber stampers? For which Raw responds, quote, I can't think of anybody that wasn't rubber. In so doing, General Mac was positioning himself to have ultimate authority and executive control in the Pacific Theater that was really heating up in 1940 and 41. He would work tirelessly to not relinquish this control over the coming decade. For Willoughby, those 2 years in the Philippines in 1940 and 41 were a proper, quiet interlude before the war kicked into gear. From spending days working on infrastructure projects around the U.S. Army base at Corregidor Island, to spending evenings with the Spanish expat elite at the Spanish Club, life could have been worse. While in the Philippines, Willoughby separated from his first wife, Juana, in 1940. Newly a bachelor at 48 years old, the aristocratic Prussian army officer met a traveling correspondent for Life magazine, who happened to be visiting Manila to write a profile on General MacArthur. This was Clare Boothe Luce, the wife of the founder of the Time Life media empire, Henry Luce. This was not surprising nor all that scandalous. The Luces enjoyed an essentially publicly open marriage, with Clare Boothe Luce's biographer Sylvia Jukes Morris noting that, quote, after a mere 2 years of marriage, both Luces had wandered off the reservation, end quote. Clare had several high-profile affairs, while her husband, after years of heavy drinking and smoking, lost much of his sexual drive. The China-born, skull-and-bones inducted media tycoon was more her vector to the high society circles that she thrived in than he ever was a real romantic interest for her. And the money surely didn't hurt either. Morris, in her biography of Clare, cites her as saying the following, quote, Mother always told me to marry for money, but she didn't do it herself, end quote. It appears that Clare did take her advice to heart. Included on her list of misters was Joseph Kennedy, whom she had allegedly slept with multiple times while he was the U.S. ambassador to London before the war. This type of extramarital activity, as we all know, would not be unheard of for a Kennedy, so it's pretty believable. But it was Willoughby that Clare Boothe Luce truly pined for, arguably for the rest of her life. Clare had already found massive success in multiple fields, as a playwright, as a social critic, as a journalist, and most recently as a magazine editor. Soon in 1943, she'd be elected as a Republican congresswoman from Connecticut, serving until 1947. She was extremely cunning, often in the background of major scandals in the United States. Willoughby, the theatrical, aristocratic future intelligence chief, was everything that the high society socialite turned woman of letters was looking for in a man. Not to mention Clare's penchant for intrigue, which Willoughby had in spades. About their time together in the Philippines, Luce stated that Willoughby was, quote, the one man that I could have run away with, end quote. A strong sentiment from the famously flighty socialite. There were, of course, as there always were with Clare Boothe Luce, ulterior motives to their affair. When she returned to the United States, she had the cover story prepared for Life magazine, a profile of Douglas MacArthur. It was featured in the December 7th, 1941 issue of the magazine, the day of the Pearl Harbor attack. I would be lying if I didn't say that Willoughby also had ulterior motives in this romance. As intelligence chief of MacArthur, and later acting in an unofficial capacity as the general's PR man, Willoughby's direct line to the Time Life media machine via his sweetheart Luce was not a bad connection to have. Doug MacArthur would appear a staggering amount of times on the covers of both Life and Time magazine over the years. Of course, he was a national figure, arguably the main hero of World War II in the American national imagination. But this did not come from nowhere. I don't think that it would be a leap to assume that Willoughby pulled some strings with Clare to get the general glowing press stateside. After her short stint in the Philippines, the two would not see each other for some time, until Willoughby visited Washington in 1943. For the duration of the war, the two sent letters back and forth across the Pacific, and even though Willoughby eventually married again in 1951, as we will see later, Clare remained in his life in several key ways. Clare Boothe Luce was a powerful person to have in one's camp, and a terrifying figure to have against you. When Willoughby arrived in Manila in the early 40s, war seemed to be brewing on the horizon. The Japanese conquests throughout Asia were pushing along, and soon enough the Germans would invade Poland, triggering the start of World War II in Europe. I have come to assume that MacArthur saw the prospects of a future Pacific War as both highly probable and as a potential opportunity. By surrounding himself with generals that were proficient in both intelligence work and civil affairs, he appeared to be feeding his lasting ambition to shape the Philippines and even maybe Asian society more broadly in the American mold. Willoughby, to his credit, predicted a war with Japan if the US were to place an oil embargo on the empire. In a 1939 reference piece written by Willoughby titled Maneuver in War, he stated the following, which remains to this day one of his most famous passages. Quote, Japan's strength and self-sufficiency in food, the masses are not likely to feel a pinch of hunger. Its weakness is lack in strategic raw materials, oil, scrap iron, copper, lead, nickel. An embargo on these vital items would not yield immediate results, since reserve stocks are undoubtedly available, but long-range pressure would be effective. Sanctions, however, are fraught with unpleasant consequences. They are not an easy halfway house between neutrality and war. It is hardly likely that the Japanese army and navy would bow to economic pressure and accept defeat without a struggle. It is far more probable that they would strike out for Netherlands, India, French Indochina, the Philippines, Malaysia, any place within naval range which would provide oil, tin, rubber, and iron. End quote. And as Willoughby foretold in 1940, in response to Japan's entry into French Indochina, the US placed an embargo on all scrap metal shipments to Japan through the Panama Canal. The next year, in July and August 1941, the FDR administration froze all Japanese assets held in the US and established an oil embargo on Japan. Since the Japanese had no significant domestic oil production of their own, this move was a ticking time bomb, as the hyper-militarist Japanese state quickly ran through their oil stockpiles. I want to highlight a few coincidences here that raise important questions regarding the FDR administration's intent with the oil embargo. A week before the August 1st embargo was put in place, on July 26, 1941, Roosevelt created the United States Army Forces in the Far East, with Douglas MacArthur as the commander. This indicates to me that the Roosevelt administration was predicting some retaliation from the Japanese, as he was positioning U.S. forces in the Pacific to be ready for war. With MacArthur's elevation to Supreme Commander in the Pacific, in November, just a month before Pearl Harbor, he also elevated then Colonel Willoughby to his new role that he would occupy for the next decade or so, as his intelligence chief in charge of Army G2 intelligence. As it had it, Japan had already started planning a surprise attack on the US's Pacific Fleet in Hawaii all the way back in January of 1941. The oil embargo expedited the plans, and on December 7th, the Japanese air fleet attacked Pearl Harbor, and just like that, the US had entered World War II in the Pacific. December 8th, not losing any time following the attack at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese launched an air raid on the Philippines. Bombers destroyed half of MacArthur's planes, as the Japanese 14th Army moved their way down from the Lingayen Gulf towards Manila. MacArthur assembled his generals and moved as many forces as possible to the U.S. Army base on Corregidor Island, off the coast of Manila on the Bataan Peninsula. Luckily, Willoughby had spent the last 2 years working on bolstering the infrastructure around Corregidor, in his capacity as Assistant Chief of Staff. The U.S. Filipino forces were wholly unprepared to repel a full-scale assault from the Japanese, despite the ongoing anxiety of an attack in the months leading up to Pearl Harbor. According to biographer David Foy, Willoughby participated in the fighting on Bataan and was awarded a Silver Star for gallantry. As MacArthur's forces were continuously pushed down the peninsula towards Corregidor, it looked certain that the main island of the Philippines, Luzon, was all but lost. On February 22, 1942, FDR ordered that MacArthur and his cadre escape the Philippines to establish a new temporary headquarters in Australia alongside the British command in the Pacific. What came next became a mythologized moment, not only within U.S. Army circles in the Pacific, but also in the history of the war in general. Waiting until the base at Corregidor was completely surrounded, MacArthur, extremely reluctantly, ordered that himself, his main staff, and his family escape by boat to the airfield at Del Monte on the southern Filipino island of Mindanao, an over 800-kilometer or 535-mile journey through increasingly occupied waters. The journey would be done covertly, using small torpedo boats known as PT boats. 5 vessels were prepared in early March, and on the 11th, they departed with some 30 passengers in total. But before leaving his prized Philippines, MacArthur uttered his now famous statement, "I shall return." Willoughby was one of the passengers, alongside MacArthur and his family, General William Marquette, and General Richard Sutherland, soon to be MacArthur's chief of staff during the war. The most notable omission was General Courtney Whitney, MacArthur's stooge, who made his way to Australia later. This must have pleased Willoughby to a certain extent, as the rival skullduggerer was not included in this harrowing episode. The small clique of army officers who escaped the Bataan Peninsula with MacArthur are known colloquially as the Bataan Gang, or the Bataan Boys. As David Foy notes, this small and increasingly insular clique of generals were, quote, an exclusive group that resented and suspected outsiders, end quote. The shared experience of the escape and reunion in Australia would bind these men together. As for MacArthur, Willoughby, and Marquette, they would all continue to work together until 1951, with Marquette becoming a key advisor to MacArthur in occupied Japan alongside Willoughby. The new Allied headquarters, originally established in Melbourne, was already in place for MacArthur and crew's arrival in March 1942. With some foresight of a very likely Japanese attack, Willoughby had already dispatched his deputy G2 intelligence officer, a man by the name of Joseph McMicking, to Australia to work with local authorities to set up their backup headquarters. McMicking, back in the Philippines during the escape from Corregidor, was one of the Bataan Gang, escaping in one of the PT boats. Born in the Philippines and of Scottish, Spanish, Filipino descent, McMicking was the only Filipino officer on MacArthur's staff. He was the son of prominent Manila lawyer Jose Lamadrid McMicking, who had once been an attorney at the same firm as MacArthur's lawyer, now General Courtney Whitney. Joseph McMicking in his own right was a prominent Filipino businessman working for a life insurance company under the Ayala & Co. umbrella, one of the largest firms in the Philippines. After the war, he'd be a managing partner and maybe the man most attributed with the resurgence of Ayala Corp., the oldest and largest conglomerate on the islands. As if this wasn't enough, he had also married into the powerful Rojas Zobel family through Mercedes Rojas Zobel. McMicking's inclusion on MacArthur's staff and Willoughby's intelligence unit represented yet another example of the general's disdain for typical West Point graduated military men. Instead, especially for intelligence purposes, he prioritized civilians who had fundamental connections in the areas of operation. McMicking and Willoughby would continue to work together throughout the war, especially in bolstering the Filipino resistance during the lead-up to the invasion. Shortly after their arrival in the relatively isolated city of Melbourne, on the southeast coast of Australia, MacArthur ordered the headquarters to be moved to Brisbane, further north still on the east coast, but a straight shot to New Caledonia, the Solomon Islands, and just around the corner from New Guinea, the first area of interest to the general in the new Pacific War. There, Willoughby established his offices under a new organization known as the Allied Intelligence Bureau, the AIB for short, which was formed to ensure that intelligence was shared between the different Allied armies in the Pacific. The AIB has been described as, quote, MacArthur's OSS, as Foy notes that he, quote, envisioned an undercover warfare organization which included a variety of intelligence and special operations groups, end quote. From pretty much day one in Australia, the feud in the Pacific between the Army Intelligence G2 section under Willoughby and the newly formed intelligence outfit the Office of Strategic Services under General Wild Bill Donovan began to erupt. Indications of tension went back to before Pearl Harbor, when a journalist employed at the Office of the Coordinator of Information, the precursor to the OSS, also under Wild Bill, met with MacArthur in the Philippines to discuss the creation of a new spy agency in the event of an Eastern War. Quoting from David Foy, quote, MacArthur saw no reason for the creation of a new intelligence service under Donovan, end quote. We have to remember here, Donovan actually served under Douglas MacArthur in World War I, in the Rainbow Division as the commander of the fighting 69th Infantry Regiment. They were pictured together receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, as I've mentioned before. Although accounts of their time together in France are mostly positive, there could have been some underlying tension for the egotistical MacArthur. That would have to do with Wild Bill Donovan receiving the Medal of Honor for his duty in World War I, but not MacArthur. Sure, Douglas MacArthur would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his World War II exploits, but at the same time, in 1941, being told that his former subordinate was seeking to expand into what Mac perceived as his territory led to a jaded and increasingly hostile response. This monopolization of intelligence gathering, dissemination, and covert ops would extend into the post-war period as well, with the CIA only really inserting itself into post-war Japan in 1948 and 49, a year after its creation. In July 1942, Donovan, as OSS chief, approached the Pentagon about establishing an OSS presence in Australia. They were supportive, but MacArthur once again opposed, stalling the process indefinitely. Continuously throughout the Pacific War, time and again, MacArthur stood up for Willoughby and his intelligence apparatus, primarily out of a desire to remain independent of the decision-makers in Washington, D.C., but also out of a personal approval of his intelligence chief. Willoughby's admiration of his boss was no secret, but MacArthur shared the sentiment, describing Willoughby as, quote, unsurpassed in excellence, end quote, in his time in the Philippines. Soon he would be put to the test, with the beginning of the island-hopping campaign that would make MacArthur an American icon. The New Guinea campaign dragged out throughout the Second World War, with brutal jungle warfare across the massive island and the archipelago surrounding it. The ongoing challenge in the Pacific was a lack of understanding of the Japanese military. In the European theater, the enemies were much more familiar, especially after 2 years of war before the US entry. But in the Pacific, the Allies had very little intel on the hierarchy and functioning of the Japanese military. That was until March of 1943, when Australian soldiers came across a discarded Japanese lifeboat from the Japanese troop transport the Taiyo Maru, beached on the coast of Goodenough Island off the coast of New Guinea. Inside, to the soldiers' surprise and amazement, they found a trove of enemy documents, including a document dated October 15, 1942, titled Register of Army Officers. This piece was rushed back to Brisbane to be translated by Allied intelligence. As it had it, the document ended up on Willoughby's desk. He quickly created a new translation section under G2 and brought in a Japanese-American master sergeant to help translate it. This intel gift produced, in May 1943, the ATIS publication number 2, an alphabetical list of Japanese officers. Totaling some 683 pages, the piece would give the Allies their first comprehensive look at the Japanese military structure and all the officers sent out as of October 1942. From a wartime intelligence standpoint, this was a brilliant piece of intel. But more conspicuously, for Willoughby's sake, this provided him with a solid list of Japanese high-value army officers. Surely such a repertoire would come in handy when he would end up in post-war Japan. As it would have it, his intelligence outfit under the Supreme Allied Command in Tokyo would rehabilitate several key Japanese officers, maybe first identified in the ATIS publication in 1943. Additionally, Willoughby's group, as we will come to see in depth next time, brought several former Imperial Japanese military men into Western intelligence circles to help shape post-war Japanese society. As the New Guinea campaign progressed through 1943, Sir Charles was dispatched on an unorthodox assignment for a wartime intel chief, back to the United States. It's here that we begin to see why MacArthur was so keen on bringing Willoughby into his camp in 1939. He saw in him political acumen. During the summer of 43, Willoughby was back stateside, not for any part of the war effort, but to test the waters for General Mac's hidden ambitions, to become President of the United States. The 1944 election was quickly approaching, and the Republican nomination was still up in the air. From my estimation, MacArthur, who was likely planning for the end of the war, wanted full authority to do as he pleased in the tenuous post-war order. And as we know by now, General Mac had heard the stories of his father's time as military governor on the Philippines. He had feuded with the real and imagined enemies against him, be it in Chaumont during World War I or in Washington during the 1930s. What better position to have ultimate authority over the shape of the post-war world than from the position of President of the United States? So Willoughby was dispatched to meet with Republican leaders in Washington, D.C. to hopefully begin MacArthur's presidential run. Back in the capital, Willoughby met with several leaders of what has been termed the so-called Old Right. This coalition of mostly Midwestern Republicans had gained prominence before and during World War I as outspoken voices against U.S. entry into the conflict in Europe. Simply put, one of the dividing lines within the U.S. establishment during the first half of the 20th century, but which can still be seen similarly to this day, was on the United States' ultimate ambitions in the world. The first group, who I will call the Atlanticist Yankees, viewed the U.S.'s destiny in Europe. As a former European colony with deep roots to the continent, especially with the UK, these types advocated for greater U.S. involvement in European affairs. These were the Woodrow Wilsons, the FDRs, and the Eisenhowers of the world. On the other end were who I will call the Asia Cowboys, a faction that at the time was often on the margins of the US establishment, and that viewed America's destiny as being in the Far East, with greater involvement in China primarily, but also Japan and the Philippines, much later Vietnam as well. These figures saw European wars as a messy waste of time for the US, which was isolated from the squabblings of these Europeans by the Atlantic Ocean. These were the people that MacArthur wanted Willoughby to target, as he viewed the world very similarly. And I'll remind you, MacArthur did have some Midwestern heritage from his family's background in Milwaukee. Willoughby agreed with this mission, and in 1943 he was quoted as telling a British lieutenant colonel that the Allies should, quote, let Nazism mellow and encourage the Germans and the Russians to kill each other off, end quote, and that Japan was the, quote, main enemy. This made him a dependable emissary to DC to rile up support for a MacArthur for President campaign. However, the tasking was a delicate one. If other politicians were to find out that General MacArthur was diverting resources away from the front to mount a presidential campaign, it could spell disaster for the commander in the Pacific. For that reason, Willoughby had to find proxies to champion their cause. Willoughby's first meeting in D.C. was with Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg from Michigan, the man who I quoted earlier as saying that the U.S. was trying to free itself from the Philippines during the Great Depression. As a typical Midwestern isolationist Republican and an outspoken critic of the New Deal, if there was one senator that would join the MacArthur cause, it'd be Vandenberg. Also, I should note, just as an aside, Arthur Vandenberg's nephew was future Air Force General Hoyt Vandenberg. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he'd be the second director of CIA from 1947 to 48. But back on track. Arthur Vandenberg was apparently convinced by Sir Charles that Mac was the man for the Oval Office. He founded a MacArthur for President committee and even published an article titled Why I Am for MacArthur in Collier's magazine. Willoughby also met with retired General Robert Wood, a hero of the old right. Born in Missouri and based for much of his life in Illinois, the West Point graduate had served as a brigadier general during World War I. In retirement, Wood joined the Sears Roebuck Company, serving as president from 1928 to 39, and later as chairman until 1954. We will get back to Robert Wood in depth in Chapter 4 of this series, as he was a key funder and organizer within the circles that Willoughby frequented after his own retirement from the army. Most notably for now, regarding Robert Wood, was that he founded the original America First Committee in 1940, one of the major pressure groups intent on stopping the US's entry into World War II. There's much to say about the America First Committee that I will save for later. Willoughby approaching Robert Wood is still significant though, not only because he was one of the most natural allies to a future MacArthur presidential run, but also because this was the first meeting of many between both men, who would remain political allies throughout the 1950s and 60s. The MacArthur for President 1944 drive ended anticlimactically. At the 44 Republican National Convention in Chicago, Governor of New York Thomas Dewey, famous for locking up and later releasing Lucky Luciano, won the nomination with 1,056 votes. MacArthur only got a single one. This would not be the end of MacArthur for president. He'd try again in 48, and he would try once more in 52. We will visit those attempts later. Willoughby's time in Washington during the summer of 1943 was not all politicking. He did still find time for play. Willoughby stayed at the Wardman Park Hotel, which was conveniently, or maybe purposely, only 1 block away from his old flame Clare Boothe Luce's apartment. The two reunited after 2 years apart and apparently shared many intimate evenings together. Clare was all for MacArthur being the next presidential nominee. She shared the same politics as Willoughby and his boss. Married to Henry Luce, who himself had grown up in China and had deep ties to the Far East, she saw America's future as in the Pacific after the war. Clare Luce would continue to swirl in the very same circles as Willoughby and Robert Wood after the war, as we will come to see. These bonds were laid in the 40s, but really came to bear in the paranoia and uncertainty of the Cold War. Willoughby was back in Australia in late December of 1943 when the New Guinea campaign was really picking up speed. The Pacific forces were making their way around the island's north shore, clearing out Japanese military installations. Now I want to zoom in a bit here to the front lines of the Pacific War to introduce a character that will be familiar to those of you who have been watching my ongoing Road to Dallas series. In early summer of 1944, American forces landed on the beaches of the island of Biak, off the northwestern coast of New Guinea. The fighting there was brutal, with some 438 US soldiers and a staggering 4,700 Japanese killed in the fighting. This was rugged jungle warfare, very typical of the Pacific Theater. For this information, I pull from a rather rare memoir titled Spy Catchers of the US Army, The War with Japan, a memoir of wartime service by former CIC Master Sergeant in the Pacific, Duval A. Edwards. I discussed the CIC, which stands for Counterintelligence Corps, briefly in my documentary on Ted Shackley, as he served in the CIC after World War II in Germany, as I'll remind you. Although after the war, the CIC operated more as a constabulary force for the US Army in occupied territories, during the conflict, the CIC acted as intelligence units on the battlefield, ultimately reporting in the Pacific to Willoughby's G2 Command in Brisbane. From Duval Edwards' memoir, we get a rare first-hand look at the CIC's activities throughout his time in the Pacific. But it is his time on the island of Biak that I want to focus in on today, because his commanding officer at the time was a man who would become infamous later under Willoughby in Japan, and as I showed, later in Cuba during the Revolution as well. Duval Edwards, commanding officer in the CIC on Biak Island in the summer of 1944, was none other than a young commissioned officer by the name of Jack Y. Canon, known by his nickname, Cactus Jack. Edwards spends his entire account of his time on Biak basically lambasting Jack Canon, whom he portrays as a psychopathic gun nut that had no respect for authority. This sounds about right from what I've researched. He shares stories of Canon, quote, pranking new arrivals by dropping live grenades a few feet behind an unsuspecting agent. He would then yell, "Grenade!" and force all his troops to take cover immediately. These jokes were not taken lightly, but they do line up with every other account of the wild gunslinger. Edwards claims in his book that the CIC role on Biak was marginal, except for one Jack Cannon. He explains that Cannon would often take his jeep out on unauthorized reconnaissance trips in the surrounding areas around their base. While on these patrols, Cannon made a major discovery and was awarded a Silver Star, the first CIC agent in the Pacific to earn one. According to the citation of his Silver Star Award, quote, "Cannon with great risk to his life made reconnaissance in a number of caves which had been occupied by Japanese, approaching dangerously close to enemy fire. He recovered more than 11 cases of enemy documents, vitally needed for the successful conclusion of the operation. The intrepidity and devotion to duty of Cannon reflect great credit on himself and the military service." End quote. Taken at face value, this is seemingly a simple story of an intelligence agent finding enemy intel on his own volition. Yet from another source, that being the book Gold Warriors by Sterling and Peggy Seagrave, we get a different interpretation of these events. In the notes of Chapter 8 of this book, they reiterate the Jack Cannon story shared by Edwards in his memoir. However, they speculate that perhaps Cactus Jack had found more than just documents in that Japanese cave on Biak. Maybe, they claim, he found stowed away Japanese gold. As explained throughout the book, the Japanese were obsessed with stowing away looted gold and other valuables across the Pacific during World War II as a future slush fund in the event of defeat. This was organized under a secret program called the Golden Lily, administered by Hirohito's younger brother Prince Chichibu. The Seagraves spend the bulk of their work discussing post-war gold discoveries across the Philippines that are fairly well documented and reported. As for hidden gold in New Guinea, or in this case the island of Biak, where Jack Cannon came across the cave complex, we have no further information. So this is purely speculation, but maybe Cannon came across a Golden Lily vault on Biak. The army, hoping to keep the discovery a secret, could have easily concocted the document cache story as cover. Regardless of whether Cannon discovered documents or buried treasure, his decoration with the Silver Star, the first CIC in the Pacific to get such an award, is what likely brought him to the attention of General Willoughby back in Brisbane. As we will come to see, Jack Cannon would become one of Willoughby's main stooges, specializing in dirty work in post-war Japan. But his story really started on the small island of Biak. As for Duval Edwards, his time with Cannon shortly came to an end when he was recalled to Brisbane for redeployment. But still, Cactus Jack clearly left an impression on him, as he spends a few pages trying to pin down his movements after their time together off the coast of New Guinea. The two reunited later, apparently when Jack Cannon would be imprisoned at Fort Sam Houston after the whole cattle shooting episode I detailed in Part 3 of The Road to Dallas. Edwards apparently paid him a visit at the stockade there, but Cactus Jack had little to say. Nonetheless, from his memoir, we get a rare glimpse at Cannon's wartime service, the only account that I've been able to track down. Around this same time, while Edwards and Cannon were fighting on Biak in July 1944, Willoughby was on a short assignment back to San Francisco, where he once again had the chance to reunite with Clare Boothe Luce. This time he was introduced to her daughter, 18-year-old Anne Clare Brokaw, taking her father's name, Clare's first husband, George Tuttle Brokaw. What is described of Willoughby's time in San Francisco with Clare and her daughter Anne by biographer Sylvia Morris is bizarre and slightly disturbing. Apparently both Clare and Anne were both pining for Willoughby at the same time. According to Morris, Anne Brokaw wrote the following in her diary. She was 18. Quote, "General Willoughby is the most romantic, one of the most handsomest and most intriguing men I have ever met. And, quote, if he were 20 years younger, he's 51 here, I should be madly in love with him. I can understand why mother is so fond of him." End quote. Apparently the three of them stayed up late in Clare's hotel suite, with Sir Charles and Clare reading aloud all three acts of Jacinto Benavente's Princess Bebe out loud for Anne. As we know, he was always game for some theater. This strange love triangle between mother and daughter would not be the first for Clare and Anne. Apparently, while Clare Luce was seeing Joe Kennedy in London in the late 30s, Anne was also seeing a young John Kennedy at the same time. Like mother, like daughter, I suppose. Besides the strange scenes at Clare's suite, Willoughby's time in San Francisco in 1944 is a blank. In his exhaustive biography of Willoughby, Foy doesn't even mention the trip at all. Yet I want to take a moment to speculate on what Willoughby might have gotten up to while at San Francisco. I want to remind you all of a young OSS officer that was posted in Northern California for most of the war that may have crossed paths with the intelligence chief while he was visiting. A young former advertising executive named Edward Lansdale was at the time working on wartime propaganda operations domestically and psyops in Asia from San Francisco. Now, there is no official record of the two meeting, but wouldn't it be perfect if they did? Edward Lansdale would of course be transferred to the Pacific after World War II, working nominally under Willoughby's G2 Army intelligence apparatus. Most famously, Lansdale would put down the Hukbalahap rebellion in the Philippines immediately after World War II, positioning him as a rising star in the nascent U.S. intelligence community. Could Willoughby have briefed Lansdale on the situation in the Pacific? As we will see, when Willoughby landed in the Philippines, he was completely opposed to working with the Huk rebels, whom he characterized as communists. Could Lansdale have been sent to the Philippines due to his previous relationship with Willoughby, starting in 1944 San Francisco? We'll probably never know, but I do think it's interesting to speculate. By late 1944, it was clear that the Japanese were on the back foot, fighting down to the last man. The rest of the story of the war in the Pacific is better told by others, so I will not dwell too much, and this has already been a long winding story. In October of 1944, General MacArthur fulfilled his promise and returned to the Philippines, with the dramatic landing on the island of Leyte. From there, U.S. forces fought through the islands, slowly pushing the Japanese out. They were facing off against the forces of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malay, a legendary Japanese general by this point. Not necessarily a hardliner and initially opposed to the war, Yamashita was a rare military commander in the Japanese army that did not espouse extreme ultranationalist views. Nonetheless, he was extremely competent and a good soldier, and the fighting, as always, was brutal. The Americans were not the only people fighting the Japanese at this point. Upon arrival in the Philippines, MacArthur, Willoughby, and the rest of the staff were met by a vibrant and effective Filipino resistance. According to David Foy, there were some 64 distinct resistance organizations. One of the most prominent was a group that were known as the Hukbalahap, which translates to the People's Army to Fight the Japanese. This was shortened to the Hooks by the Americans. First founded in 1942, many around MacArthur argued that the Hooks were a dependable ally in the fight against the Japanese on the islands. One such figure was General Courtney Whitney, the Manila lawyer who acted as MacArthur's personal aide. He had been put in charge of the Philippine Regional Section, the U.S. Army organ in charge of working with Filipino resistance orgs. Willoughby saw this as a slight. He was in charge of intelligence, and this type of covert work appeared right up his alley, especially given his past work in the Rif War, for instance. Willoughby voiced his animosity with Whitney, claiming that he, quote, had considerable influence on General MacArthur, which to us who had been with the general longer, was mysterious to us to this day, end quote. Willoughby believed that the Hooks were communists, and therefore was completely opposed to supporting them. This left him marginalized during the Philippines campaign, a real blow to his ego. It was also in the Philippines that Willoughby made his most egregious battlefield estimates until the Korean War. These were some major blunders. In October 1944, for example, he officially estimated that there were some 172,000 Imperial Japanese troops on the island of Luzon awaiting them. The reality was far bleaker, with some 275,000 troops waiting. His subordinate, Colonel Horton White, provided a more accurate estimate of 234,000, but this was pushed aside in favor of Willoughby's numbers. In another example, he estimated that a Japanese garrison had some 21,000 troops. There were really 35,000. Conventional military intelligence was not necessarily his specialty, as we will come to see. He thrived in the world of black ops, making his sidelining in favor of Whitney in the Philippines even more disappointing. We come up here to the end of the war. The Philippines were liberated in early 1945, largely completed with the capture of Manila on March 3, 1945. Originally, MacArthur had drawn up plans for a naval invasion of the Japanese home islands codenamed Operation Downfall. What was estimated to be an unimaginably gruesome operation never came to bear, as on August 6th and 9th, President Truman ordered the dropping of atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, two major industrial centers in Japan. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender to the U.S. The war in the Pacific and World War II as a whole came to an end. As MacArthur and his cadre of generals embarked on September 2nd to sign the Articles of Surrender on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, it appeared that the world was finally returning to peace once again. Yet as we will see, Willoughby's war was simply beginning. First and foremost, if you are watching this video on its release date, Merry Christmas to those who celebrate, and Happy Holidays to those who don't. As always, thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like and a comment and let me know your thoughts down below. First and foremost, I would like to thank all of my supporters on Patreon for making these videos in Season 3 possible. On screen now are my producer tier patrons. The video you just watched was first made available to them on July 22nd, 2025. If you wish to get early access to my content, get access to small Patreon bonus videos, and connect with me on a more personal level, please consider checking out my page on Patreon, linked below in the description. There you can find my newest series premiering right now, focusing on the history of modern Japan, which will give important context to the next episode of the Willoughby series in post-war Japan. I just released the third chapter of that series on Patreon earlier this week, covering Japan's early imperialistic activities on the Asian mainland at the turn of the century, and their role in spurring the Chinese Revolution. Since I have all the scripts written already, I am hoping to get those out on Patreon in quick succession throughout the first 2 months of 2026. So, if you're looking for something to watch over the holidays, or are simply interested in learning about Japan's drive towards total war, check out my Patreon, linked below. Each of those episodes are over an hour long, and I think in many ways this will be my most ambitious series yet. So that marks the end of Eyes Wide Open Season 3, and I hope you have all enjoyed the videos I produced over the past year. This channel will not be completely inactive over the next year, but I will be slowing down my uploads in preparation for Season 4, which I will be producing throughout 2026. I want to take this opportunity to ask you all to let me know in the comments what you enjoyed most of this past season of Eyes Wide Open. I will be wrapping up the Willoughby series, and we'll be making another 5 to 6 parts of The Road to Dallas in the first half of 2026. But beyond that, my year is open. With that said, what would you like to see from me in this upcoming year? Anyway, that's all I've got for you today, and for a while. I won't be gone forever, as I hope to share with you some new content in the first months of 2026. So once again, Happy Holidays, Merry Christmas. I hope you are all surrounded by loved ones and family members in safety and health. Thank you all for watching, and remember to always keep your eyes wide open. Take care.